the chapel of false salvation. The night air clung to the skin like damp cloth, thick with the musk of stagnant water and the faint sweetness of decaying magnolia blossoms. In the South Carolina low country, the marshes seemed alive, cicadas screaming. From the black tree line, frogs croaking in uneven rhythm, and somewhere beneath it all, a low hum that sounded too deliberate to belong to any insect. For those who knew the stories, that sound wasn't just the swamp. It was memory. The restless voices of the vanished, swallowed whole by the earth yet never at peace. Locals whispered about the Angel's Rest Chapel, the way children whisper about the monster beneath their bed, with a mixture of disbelief and terror. A weathered wooden sign, half buried in creeping vines, marked the trail that led to it. The letters had been carved deep, but time had gnawed at them until only fragments remained. Ang. EST. Few dared to follow that path after sundown. Even in daylight, it held the kind of silence that prickled the skin, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Between 1789 and 1832, more than 200 souls had vanished after, seeking sanctuary within its walls. Some were enslaved people desperate for freedom, others poor wanderers chasing rumors of salvation. None were ever seen again. Authorities dismissed the disappearances as coincidence, blaming storms, panthers, or swamp fevers, but the ones who lived nearby knew better. They heard the chapel bells ringing on nights when no service was scheduled, saw a lantern light moving between the cypress trees long after midnight, and sometimes, most chilling of all, they swore. They saw pale figures watching them from the water's edge. The Whitworth family had built the chapel, and it was the Whitworths, locals whispered, who had turned faith itself into bait. A family of shadows. In 1789, Gabriel Whitworth arrived from Virginia, a man with silver hair though not yet 50, and eyes the color of frost-bitten steel. He called his estate Seraphim's Grace, a 1,000-acre plantation carved from marshland 30 miles inland from Charleston. To his peers, Gabriel was a man of vision, cultured, charismatic, and endlessly ambitious. But beneath the veneer of hospitality lay a kind of hunger that went beyond profit, beyond land, beyond power. His wife, Constance, played the role of porcelain hostess. She smiled, she served, she floated through gatherings with the grace of a woman who seemed untouched by the world, but her eyes betrayed her. They held the distant look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, swaying between fascination and despair. Their children, 5 of them, were as much a part of the legend as the chapel itself. Ezekiel, tall and calculating, had cruelty etched into his smile. Miriam, with golden hair and eyes too bright, was the family's lure, her gentleness a mask stretched over something unholy. Cain and Abel, the twins, mirrored each other in form but not in intent, one brutish, the other a craftsman of psychological torment. And Lilith, the youngest, with her quiet stare and unsettling composure, was said to be Gabriel's masterpiece in the making. The Whitworth name became synonymous with influence in the county. They gave generously to the Methodist Church, hosted lavish gatherings, and cultivated a reputation for benevolence on their plantation. Their enslaved workers were fed better than most, clothed more comfortably, and even permitted Sundays of relative freedom. Neighbors praised Gabriel's progressive ideals, but what they did not see, or perhaps chose not to see, was the other side of that generosity. For the Whitworths understood something that made them richer and far more dangerous than their peers. Mercy, when displayed in public, could disguise unspeakable cruelty in private. The chapel's purpose, Angel's Rest Chapel, was finished in 1788, its whitewashed exterior gleaming against the moss-draped oaks that lined its path. By design, it was larger than most plantation chapels, seating nearly 200, though no congregation in the area could ever fill it. It seemed to invite strangers, wanderers, the desperate. But the true purpose of the chapel was buried beneath it. Behind the altar, hidden by a carved wooden panel of the Archangel Michael, a narrow stair led downward into stone and shadow. The basement was a labyrinth. Rows of cramped cells with shackles bolted into the walls, each built with walls thick enough to swallow screams. A narrow passage led to a side building disguised as a vestry, which housed surgical tables and tools that gleamed too brightly for a holy place. The Whitworths had built not a sanctuary, but a trap. Rumors of freedom were deliberately sown across the South, whispers that Angel's Rest was a station on the secret road to liberation. And the desperate, the hunted, the broken came. They were welcomed with warmth and prayer, given food, water, and hope. For a night or two they believed salvation had finally reached them, but in truth they had entered the lion's den. Records discovered decades later, hidden in county archives, revealed the meticulousness of the Whitworth operation. Each guest was catalogued, name if given, age, health, information of potential use. Interrogations masqueraded as confessions. Torture was called purification. And when the Whitworths had extracted all they could, bodies vanished, sold to medical colleges under forged certificates, burned in hidden kilns, or buried shallow in the swamplands where the mud swallowed secrets whole. First whispers of doubt not. Everyone believed the Whitworth's spotless facade. Some field workers whispered about hearing wailing beneath the chapel during Sunday sermons. A fisherman claimed he saw Gabriel's brother, Seraph, gaunt and white-haired, a failed physician turned shadowy recluse, loading crates onto a river barge at midnight. The crates, he swore, dripped. Reverend Hartwell, the Methodist circuit writer, once confided to a colleague that something about Gabriel's theology unsettled him. Redemption through suffering, Gabriel preached, his voice echoing through the rafters. Only through pain can the soul be refined, only through sacrifice can salvation be assured. Hartwell found the message troubling, but he could not deny the man's charisma. Congregants left the chapel trembling, convinced they had brushed against the divine, and so the whispers were ignored, chalked up to superstition. But fear has a way of clinging. Parents warned their children never to wander near the oaks after dark. Hunters avoided the marshes that bordered Seraphim's grace. And when strangers vanished, travelers, runaways, even the occasional merchant, people muttered the same thing. They went looking for angels and found devils instead. The autumn. Of shadows in the autumn of 1791, storms battered the coast, driving more desperate souls inland. That season, 43 people vanished into Angel's Rest Chapel. The Whitworths grew bolder, refining their methods. Ezekiel devised a system for sorting victims. The strong and young kept alive longer for interrogation, the elderly disposed of quickly. Miriam's gentle hands became the most feared weapon of all, her kindness leading victims to reveal everything about their families, their roots, their hopes. It was during this time that neighbors began to notice something strange. The Whitworth children, especially the twins, grew distant from their peers. Cain's strength was whispered about after he crushed a hunting dog's skull with his bare hands. Abel, by contrast, was seen writing long into the night, his ledger filled not with scripture, but with detailed accounts of procedures. And Lilith, only 16, moved like a shadow at her father's side, her youthful innocence turned toward something far more chilling. By 1795, Angel's Rest was no longer a chapel. It was a factory. Souls went in, prophets came out, and the swamp itself seemed to darken under the weight of its secrets, the first crack in the facade yet. For all their cunning, the Whitworths could not control every whisper. In Charleston, abolitionists began noting patterns. Escaped slaves who vanished somewhere between the coast and Columbia, their names erased from every trace of record. Some spoke of a chapel where angels promised freedom but delivered silence. The rumors reached a man named Jeremiah Morrison, a merchant by trade but abolitionist by faith. Morrison had heard many grim stories in his work, but this one gnawed at him. He arrived in Charleston in the winter of 1798, under the guise of establishing rice trade connections. But his true mission was to uncover why so many runaways vanished in South Carolina's low country. It was Morrison who first wrote the name Whitworth in his journal, circling it twice, his ink blotched by the tremor in his hand. He did not yet know the scale of what he had uncovered. He did not yet know that the Whitworths were more than killers. They were architects of something far larger, far darker, a society of shadows that would stretch across states. But on a cold December night, standing at the edge of the swamp with lantern light trembling in his grip, Morrison felt it. The hum in the trees. The sound that was not quite wind, not quite water. He realized then that the Whitworths had built more than a chapel. They had built a legend. And legends are far harder to kill than men. As Morrison took his first cautious step toward Angel's Rest, he noticed something on the ground. A shoe, half sunk in the mud. It was small, a child's. The leather was cracked, the laces torn, but what made his blood run cold was the mark scratched into its heel, a crude carving of wings, jagged and unfinished. The Whitworths weren't just hunting adults, they were taking children too. The Order of Fallen Angels. The shoe haunted Morrison's thoughts long after he left it buried in the swamp's mud. Its crude winged carving felt less like ornament and more like a signature, an obscene brand left by people who believed themselves holy executioners. He pressed on, lantern in hand, though the shadows seemed to lean closer with every step. The locals had warned him. "You don't go looking for angels out there," an old fisherman muttered in Charleston's market when Morrison asked too many questions. "Not unless you want wings carved on your back." It might have been superstition, but Morrison had lived long enough to know that superstition was often truth spoken in a language the powerful ignored. By the time he returned to his rented room in Charleston, his course was set. If the Whitworth family truly ran the chapel as people whispered, then he had uncovered something far worse than plantation cruelty. This was systematized, engineered, a business masked by sermons and song. And if he was right, the Whitworths weren't acting alone. Building the puzzle, Morrison began with ledgers. Charleston's docks were busy with rice shipments, indigo, and lumber. Yet among them, he noticed unusual freight entries. Small crates, shipped regularly upriver to medical schools in Savannah and Philadelphia. The manifests listed specimens and teaching materials vague enough to slip past officials. The sender's mark was not Whitworth, but an innocuous seal, a feather crossed with a star. It was Miriam's handwriting, disguised in flourishes that appeared on several receipts. Morrison compared them with samples taken from church donation records. The loops and strokes were identical. The Whitworths were not only supplying bodies, they were moving them under the very eyes of Charleston's educated elite. And those institutions had asked no questions. When Morrison visited one of the city's professors under the pretense of arranging shipping contracts, the man, rosy-faced from wine, boasted openly, "South Carolina's a fine source for our anatomical studies, better than London, fresh material properly embalmed, our suppliers meticulous." Morrison forced a polite smile, but his stomach churned. Fresh material, as if human beings were oranges plucked from a grove. The order revealed, his investigation led him to whispers of a society that called itself the Order of Fallen Angels. At first, he dismissed it as rumor. But then he found a letter, carelessly discarded in a Charleston boarding house fireplace. Half-burned but still legible, it read, "Salvation requires sacrifice. As Gabriel has written, redemption is forged through pain. The order grows, and with it, our influence. Soon, what began in South Carolina shall stretch to Georgia, Virginia, and beyond. We are instruments of God's terrible mercy." The signature chilled him. Ezekiel Whitworth. If true, then Angel's Rest Chapel wasn't just a killing ground. It was the prototype for a network, a conspiracy that believed murder was liturgy and prophet divine blessing. Into the web by spring of 1799, Morrison knew he couldn't work alone. He contacted Samuel Washington, a free black man from Baltimore, who had infiltrated slave markets before. Washington's courage was legendary among abolitionists. He had walked chains to learn their links and had lived to tell it. Morrison presented the evidence, the shipping manifests, the letter, the shoe, and Washington did not flinch. "I'll go inside," Washington said. You need eyes where you cannot walk. A man with my skin can move through their trap. They'll believe me, pray. Morrison's chest tightened. He had seen men broken by far less, but Washington's resolve was iron. If children are vanishing, he added, we can't hesitate. Every day we wait is another life measured in coin. And so the plan was set. Washington would pose as an escaped slave and allow himself to be guided to Angel's Rest. Morrison would remain in Charleston, tracing the outer network, shipping routes, complicit doctors, corrupt officials. Between the two of them, they would pull the veil from the Whitworth's empire. The snare tighten's April brought suffocating humidity, the air wet as breath. Washington walked the forest path toward Angel's Rest with a limp he did not need but wore convincingly. He carried forged papers that marked him as property of a Virginia planter, accidentally left behind in his escape. The story was baited to draw questions and sympathy from whoever greeted him. Miriam Whitworth met him at the chapel door. Her beauty was almost luminous in the torchlight, her smile warm, her voice gentle. You poor soul, she murmured. You've found your way at last. For a moment, Washington nearly believed her. Her touch was so tender, her eyes so full of pity, that it was easy to imagine she was truly an angel. But then her pupils flicked sideways, just for a breath, toward the altar, toward the hidden stair Washington had been warned about. Her smile never faltered, but Washington knew he was in the presence of a predator cloaked in grace. That night he was given food, fresh clothes, and a pallet to rest on. He prayed softly, as if in gratitude. But in truth he was listening, counting the footsteps overhead, memorizing the creak of boards, straining for the faintest sound beneath. When the hour grew late, he heard it, the muffled cry of someone in pain buried deep below the chapel's floor. It lasted only seconds, then cut off. The silence that followed was worse. Shadows in the cells. The next day, Washington met Gabriel, himself. The patriarch was every bit the figure Morrison had described, tall, silver-haired, voice booming with authority. His sermon to the guests was on suffering as the pathway to heaven. He spoke of fire as cleansing, of agony as the forge of the soul. His audience, desperate, broken, listened in silence. But Washington noticed their eyes. Some were glazed with terror, others sunk in resignation. They weren't congregants. They were captives pretending to be faithful, because to resist was to die faster. That night, Washington's suspicions were confirmed. He was awakened by Cain and Abel Whitworth dragging a man down the altar stair. The man's pleas were muffled by cloth, his wrists bound. Washington pretended to sleep, but his heart pounded so loudly he feared it might betray him. When dawn came, the man had not returned. His pallet lay empty, his name unspoken. Washington knew he was next. Morrison's discovery. While Washington walked the edge of death inside Angel's Rest, Morrison unearthed something equally damning. He traced a shipment to Philadelphia, bribed a dock worker, and pried open a crate marked medical supplies. Inside was a coffin-sized box packed with sawdust and herbs, and within it, wrapped carefully in cloth, was the body of a young woman. Her expression was frozen in pain. Her skin bore faint bruises at her wrists and throat. Pinned to her garment was a forged death certificate. Fever, transient free woman, unclaimed. The handwriting was serif's. Morrison felt bile rise in his throat. It was no longer rumor, no longer suspicion. He held proof in his hands, proof that the Whitworths had transformed people into product. But he also knew that evidence meant nothing if Washington died inside Angel's Rest, and so he rushed south toward the swamp, toward the chapel where angels wore human faces. The night Morrison arrived near Seraphim's Grace, fog rose from the marsh in curling fingers. He kept low, moving toward the chapel's faint torchlight. From inside came the sound of hymns, sung too slowly, too mournfully, to be worship. And then, clear as day, he heard a child's voice among them. A girl, no more than 12, Her, song breaking into sobs between verses. Morrison froze, his blood turning cold. The Whitworths were not only trapping the desperate, they were training their children to sing in harmony with the screams. The chapel beneath the chapel. The hymn ended, and silence pressed down on Angel's Rest like a burial shroud. The chapel smelled of candle wax and sweat, but beneath it lay another odor, one faint, metallic, unmistakable. Washington had smelled it before on battlefields. Blood. That night, as the other seekers slept on their pallets, Abel Whitworth approached Washington with a lantern in hand. "Father wishes to speak with you," he said, his voice soft as velvet yet cold enough to freeze marrow. Washington rose slowly, masking his pounding heart. Abel's eyes lingered on him like a man appraising livestock. The boy led him past the altar to the panel carved with Michael striking down the wicked. Abel's hand pressed a hidden notch, and the panel swung inward, exhaling a breath of damp air from the stairwell below. "Down," Abel murmured. Washington obeyed. Into the eye, cells, the air grew colder with each step. The lantern's flame trembled against the stone walls, revealing rust-colored stains that no amount of scrubbing had erased. The staircase twisted down into a narrow hall lined with iron-barred doors. Behind them, shapes shifted in shadow. Faces peered out, gaunt and desperate. A man's lips moved soundlessly. A woman clutched a bundle against her chest. Rocking it through the bundle was only rags. Washington's stomach turned, but he forced calm into his features. He could not appear horrified. Not yet. At the hall's end stood Seraph Whitworth. Thin, as a gravedigger's spade, his white hair clung damp to his temples. His pale green eyes seemed to glow in the lantern light, unblinking, reptilian. In his hand, he held a quill stained darker than ink. Before him lay a ledger, thick with notes. "Another guest," Seraph murmured, his voice rasping like dry parchment. "Let us see what music he makes when pressed." The first ordeal, Washington was placed in a cell barely larger than a coffin turned upright. Shackles snapped around his wrists and ankles. Seraph examined him the way a scholar examines a specimen, curious, detached, almost admiring. "You've traveled far," Seraph said. "Virginia? Maryland? No matter. They all tell stories, and stories are currency." He leaned close. "You will give us names, safe houses, conductors, the paths the faithful walk to freedom, not because you wish to, but because every man sings eventually." Washington lowered his gaze, muttering a prayer in his mind. He had trained for this, lies laced with fragments of truth. That was the only way to survive. Seraph drew a slender blade from a velvet pouch. "Shall we begin?" The blade never cut deep. It didn't need to. Pain came in pinpricks, in pressure applied to places Washington didn't know could burn. Seraph's knowledge of the body was terrifying. How to make the lungs gasp without suffocation. How to coax nerves into fire without leaving scars. Washington bit his lip until he tasted copper. He whispered false names, false roots, weaving, lies that sounded plausible. Abel stood nearby, taking careful notes, his quill scratching like a locust's legs. Hours passed. Washington lost sense of time. When at last Seraph closed the ledger, he smiled faintly. "Promising," he said. "You'll stay useful for now." Morrison's approach, while Washington fought to keep his mind intact, Morrison crept through, the swamp's edge drawn by the dim glow of the chapel's lanterns. He had spent days gathering proof. The body shipped north, the forged certificates, the letters. But evidence was only parchment unless he could rescue the living. He crouched, behind a fallen log, staring at the chapel's windows. The hymns had ended, but he could still hear faint sounds rising through the cracks in the floorboards. Muffled sobs, the clink of chains. His hand gripped the pistol beneath his coat. But he knew rushing in would mean slaughter, not rescue. He would need patience, observation, and most of all, timing. Then, through the warped glass, Morrison glimpsed something that froze him. A girl, no more than 13, stood inside, holding a tray of bread. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her movements stiff, as if she were both servant and student. When the door opened and Miriam whispered to her, the girl nodded, descending toward the altar's hidden panel. Morrison's heart lurched. The Whitworth children weren't only participants, they were apprentices. Secrets in the dark back below. Washington slumped in his cell, his breath ragged, wrists raw from shackles. From the shadows beside him came a whisper. "You ain't from Virginia." He startled. A man in the next cell leaned close to the bars, his eyes hollow but sharp. "I seen your hands too clean. You're no field slave. You're here to watch." Washington swallowed. "And if I am?" The man's lips trembled. "Then listen. They keep ledgers, names, every soul that passes through. If you make it out, you carry those names. Tell the world." Washington's chest tightened. Here was the proof Morrison needed, more damning than any crate or rumor. But first he had to survive long enough to find it. That night, Grace Whitworth, one of Michael's young daughters, slipped into the hall to deliver food. Her steps faltered when she saw Washington's bloodied wrists. Her eyes brimmed with something none of her kin had shown. "Pity. Eat," she whispered, sliding bread through the bars. "Don't let Father hear you pray too loud. He says prayers make them struggle longer." Washington met her gaze, a child of 13, caught between obedience and conscience. He saw in her the only crack in the Whitworth wall. The next day, Seraph prepared his instruments again. Abel held the ledger open, ready to record. But before Seraph could begin, Gabriel himself entered the chamber. His presence filled the air like thunder. "This one's different," Gabriel said, his icy gaze locking onto Washington. "I smell deceit in his tongue. Tonight we shall see if the angels favor him, or if he belongs to the fire." He gestured to Kane, who lifted a heavy iron key. "Take him to the furnace." Washington's blood ran cold. He had survived the blade. He might even withstand lies. But no man could survive the fire, and from the corner, Grace dropped the empty tray she carried, the clatter echoing like a pistol shot. Her eyes locked on Washington's, wide with silent warning. The furnace awaited. The furnace of Seraphim's grace. The key scraped in the lock, a sound so final it made Washington's heart slam against his ribs. Kane's hands, brutish and sure, dragged him from the cell. The hallway smelled thicker now, not just mildew and sweat, but the acrid tang of ash. The furnace, Washington realized, was not metaphor. It was a machine of fire. The prisoners whispered as he passed, their voices a threadbare prayer. "God save him. God save him." But Washington knew their prayers had never been answered. Here, the Chamber of Flames, the Whitworths had built their furnace beneath the chapel, disguised above as a potter's kiln. Kane shoved Washington into a stone chamber where the air shimmered with heat. The walls were blackened with soot, the iron door of the furnace glowing faintly orange, pulsing like a malignant heart. Gabriel Whitworth stood beside it, robes loose, his face illuminated by the flickering glow. His voice rose in solemn cadence as though he were conducting a holy rite. "Fire," he intoned, "is the breath of the Almighty. It purifies. It consumes the unworthy and forges truth from lies. Tonight we test the measure of this man's soul." Miriam entered with her ever-serene smile, her golden hair catching the light. She carried a bowl of oil, dipping her fingers, and tracing symbols on Washington's chest as though anointing him. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes glittered with cruel anticipation. Washington's knees threatened to buckle. He remembered his training in Philadelphia. Hold the lie, mix truth with falsehood, never let them see fear. But as the furnace door cracked open, releasing a blinding wave of heat, that discipline nearly dissolved. The trial begins. Cain and Abel bound him to a frame of iron, positioned just close enough to the furnace door that his skin prickled. Seraph hovered nearby, quill poised above the ledger. "Confess," Gabriel commanded. "Tell us the roots. Tell us the names of the shepherds who lead lambs astray, or watch your flesh melt as proof of your damnation." Washington closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He spoke of roads half real, of towns that did exist but were far from any underground path. He gave the name of a minister, long dead, claiming him as an active conductor. He wove a tapestry of lies believable enough to satisfy but useless if acted upon. The flames roared. Gabriel studied his face, searching for cracks. "You resist well," the patriarch murmured, "but all men burn alike in the end." Miriam leaned close, whispering in his ear, "I'll tell you a secret. No one passes the fire. Even if you speak the truth, Father keeps pushing until the screams break. You're not meant to survive, you're meant to sanctify the furnace." Her lips curved in a sweet smile as she stepped back, leaving the weight of her words to crush him. The girl's defiance, from the shadows at the chamber's edge, Grace appeared again. She carried a bucket of water, her face pale in the furnace, glow. Gabriel barked at her to prepare the room. She nodded, eyes downcast, but when she passed near Washington, she dropped her gaze long enough to whisper, barely audible, "Tonight. I'll help you." It was not hope, not yet, but it was the first fissure in the Whitworth's wall of fire. Morrison above. Meanwhile, Morrison crouched in the grove of moss-draped oaks, every sense sharpened. Through a crack in the chapel's foundation, he glimpsed the faint orange pulse of the furnace below. The hymns had ended. Now came the silence of ritual. He felt the hairs on his neck rise. 2 Whitworth slaves carried ash buckets from the outbuilding and dumped them into the swamp. Morrison crept closer. The ash floated across the water like ghostly fog. Mixed within were fragments of bone. He pressed a hand to his mouth, bile threatening to rise. There was no time for hesitation. Washington was inside, and if Morrison delayed, those fragments would be all that remained of him. The fires hunger back in the chamber. The iron frame grew hotter, the cuffs burning against Washington's wrists. Sweat ran into his eyes. The furnace roared louder, flames licking hungrily as Cain cranked the door wider. Gabriel lifted his arms in mock benediction. "The angels await, son. If your words were false, the fire will strip them away. If true, you shall burn as a martyr of lies." Seraph leaned close with clinical fascination, ready to record how long it would take for skin to blister, how long the tongue could still form words. Washington's strength wavered. The heat scorched through his breath, searing his throat. For a heartbeat, he considered telling them everything. Morrison's name, Philadelphia, the network of abolitionists. Anything just to make it stop. But then he caught sight of Grace, her lips pressed together, eyes burning with silent urgency. "Tonight," she had whispered. He clenched his jaw and screamed, not confession, but defiance. "You'll choke on your own fire before I give you truth." The roar of the furnace swallowed his voice. Gabriel's eyes gleamed with fanatic delight. "Then let the angels judge you." Cain pushed the frame closer. Heat clawed Washington's skin, pain exploding white in his vision. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the chamber, the crack of glass shattering above. All heads turned upward. Gabriel's expression darkened. "We are not alone," he hissed. Washington's heart leapt. Morrison. He had come. But then Miriam's voice, calm and venomous, sliced the air. "If intruders walk among us, let them join the furnace as well." The frame lurched closer to the flames. Washington felt fire kiss his flesh, and somewhere above, Morrison raised his pistol, stepping into the lion's den. Ashes in the chapel. The furnace roared like a living thing, fire gnashing at Washington's skin when the sound of breaking glass shattered the Whitworth ritual. Every face in the chamber turned upward. Gabriel's features hardened, but not with fear, only irritation, as if heaven itself had interrupted his sermon. "Cain," he barked, "seal the hall. Abel, fetch the rifles." His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had commanded this nightmare too long to imagine losing control. But for the first time, control was slipping. Morrison's descent above. Morrison landed heavily on the chapel floor, pistol drawn. The broken window behind him spilled shards across the pews. Candles guttered in the draught, their flames bending toward the hidden stairwell. The air was thick with incense and smoke, but beneath it, Morrison smelled something fouler, burnt hair, charred flesh. His eyes fixed on the altar. The panel was ajar, and from its seam glowed a faint orange pulse. He knew instantly where Washington had been taken. Morrison, he whispered to himself, steadying his hand. If you're to die tonight, make it count. Below the altar, Cain hauled Washington's frame backward from the furnace, not out of mercy, but because Gabriel had raised a hand. Wait, the patriarch said. His ears caught the faint thud of boots above. Our guest has arrived. Seraph's lips curved in a ghastly smile. Another body for the ledger. Washington's skin burned in patches, breath ragged. But when he heard the words, his pulse surged, not in despair, but in recognition. Morrison was here. Grace's eyes flicked between them, her face a mask of terror and decision. Collision. The altar groaned open. Morrison descended, pistol raised, eyes scanning the furnace chamber. He froze at the sight. Washington bound to iron, Gabriel poised like a priest before fire, Seraph hunched with his ledger, and the Whitworth children circling like carrion birds. Step away from him, Morrison thundered. In the name of God and the Republic, step away. Gabriel only smiled. Another preacher of false freedom. Tell me, stranger, do you believe your pistol has more power than holy fire? He extended his hands toward the furnace. The glow painted his face a mask of beatific madness. Fire does not lie. The struggle Cain lunged first, a brute charging with iron chains. Morrison fired one deafening shot in the stone chamber. The bullet tore through Cain's shoulder, sending him sprawling but not down. Abel shouted, grabbing a rifle from the wall, but Washington, summoning the last of his strength, kicked his leg against Abel's shin. The rifle clattered, discharging into the ceiling. Stone dust rained down like ash. Miriam laughed, the sound chilling in its delight. She moved toward Morrison with deceptive grace, a dagger gleaming in her hand. You've wandered into the lion's mouth, she whispered, but Morrison did not falter. Then I'll break its teeth. The turning point, in the chaos, Grace darted forward. With trembling hands, she unlatched the cuff from Washington's wrist, slipping him a shard of iron she had hidden beneath her dress. Go, she hissed. Washington stared, shocked. Why? Her lips quivered. Because I can't bear their hymns anymore. It was the first true act of rebellion to ever echo in that chamber. Fire unleashed. Gabriel roared in fury. Ungrateful. Child. His hand seized a torch, thrusting it toward Grace, but Washington, half-freed, bloodied, desperate, swung the iron shard. The blow struck Gabriel's wrist, the torch tumbling into the oil Miriam had spilled during her mock anointing. Flames leapt instantly, racing across the floor, climbing the walls like living serpents, the chamber filled with smoke, screams, and the roar of the furnace answering its newborn siblings. Morrison fired again, the shot grazing Seraph's ledger. Pages fluttered into the fire, names and numbers burning into oblivion. Grab what you can, Morrison shouted. We need the records. But Abel was already lunging for the fallen ledger, Cain dragging himself up with bloodied chains, Miriam laughing even as the flames licked her gown. The Whitworths did not fear the fire. They belonged to it. Washington staggered free of the frame, coughing, skin blistered. Grace clung to his arm, eyes streaming from smoke. Morrison shoved them toward the stairwell, but as they ascended, Gabriel's voice thundered from the inferno. You cannot kill angels. We rise from fire. And then, the sound of more footsteps above. Heavy. Many. Not Morrison's allies, but Whitworth men answering the alarm. The stairwell ahead was filling with shadows. Escape was no longer certain. The last psalm of fire. The stairwell shook with footsteps, dozens, maybe more. Morrison froze, pistol raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Washington staggered beside him, Grace pressed to his side like a trembling shadow. Above, the silhouettes of men with rifles filled the chapel's glow, their eyes burning with fanatical loyalty. Below, the furnace chamber had become a vision of hell. Flames clawed the walls, licking at the Whitworth children as they moved through, the inferno like dancers. Kane dragged his bleeding arm but laughed through gritted teeth. Abel scrambled after the ledger as pages disintegrated to ash. Miriam, her gown smoldering, sang a hymn above the roar, her voice unbroken, beautiful and terrible. And Gabriel stood at the heart of it all, arms raised, fire wreathing his silver hair, his eyes two cold stars. The standoff back. Morrison shouted, leveling his pistol at the armed men. His voice cracked but held. "This house is coming down, and I'll take every one of you with it." One of the Whitworth men sneered. "You'll die first, Yankee." But before he could fire, the chapel floor groaned. Heat surged upward through the cracks, warping the wood. The men glanced at one another, hesitating. Even loyalty to devils falters when the earth itself feels like it might collapse. Grace's small voice cut through the chaos. "They won't stop, not until the fire takes us all." Inferno of faith from below, Gabriel's sermon rose through the smoke. "This is our rapture, children. Through fire we ascend." He seized the fallen torch and thrust it into the furnace, flinging the door wide. A roar of flame belched outward, and the iron frame split apart, molten fragments spraying across the chamber. Seraph darted to shield his notes, his pale face lit with lunatic rapture. "Record it," Gabriel bellowed. "Record how angels are made." Miriam's hymn swelled, turning to a scream of ecstasy as fire consumed her gown. She did not stop singing, even as smoke choked the words. Washington's stomach lurched. He saw then what Morrison already knew. The Whitworths weren't trying to survive. They meant to become legend in fire. Desperate flight. The stairwell shuddered. Morrison fired once into the ceiling, scattering the Whitworth men, then shoved Washington and Grace ahead. "Move! If we don't get out now, this place becomes our tomb." They stumbled into the chapel's nave. Smoke thickened, stained glass cracked in the heat. Hymnals smoldered in the pews. The altar behind them collapsed with a thunderous crash, flames surging up as if hell itself clawed free. But outside more shadows gathered. The Whitworth loyalists circled the chapel, rifles glinting in the firelight. Washington wheezed. "We're trapped." Morrison's eyes darted, desperate. Then he saw it, the steeple rope dangling above, its cord half burnt but still intact. "Up," he barked. "It's the only way." Betrayal in the flames, Grace hesitated, her face pale. She clutched Washington's hand, but her gaze drifted back toward the altar, toward her family burning below. I can't leave them," she whispered. Washington grabbed her shoulders, eyes blazing. "They're not angels, Grace, they're butchers. You saved me, you can save yourself." Her lips trembled. For a moment it seemed she would climb. But then Miriam's voice, faint through smoke, echoed one last phrase of her hymn. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She ripped her hand from Washington's grasp. "I'm sorry." And before he could stop her, she vanished back into the fire. "Washington," shouted her name, the sound swallowed in the roar of collapse. The fall of Seraphim's Grace. The steeple bell tolled once as they climbed the rope, the sound warped by heat, a death knell for the Whitworth Empire. They scrambled through the upper hatch as flames devoured the sanctuary below. Outside, night was a nightmare of firelight. The chapel's roof caved, sparks shooting into the swamp air. The Whitworth men scattered, torn between loyalty and terror. Washington and Morrison staggered into the grove, coughing, clothes singed. Behind them, Seraphim's Grace finally collapsed, flames and smoke spiraling into the heavens like the last psalm of a damned congregation. The ledger's survival Morrison doubled over, gasping. Washington leaned against a tree, half conscious. Then Morrison's eyes fixed on something amid the chaos, a charred figure crawling from the ruin, clutching a half-burned book. Seraph. His body a ruin of burns, his hair white ash, but his hands cradling the ledger like scripture. He met Washington's gaze and rasped through blood, "The fire does not end it, only spreads it." Then, with a final heave, he vanished into the swamp's shadows. Morrison cursed, aiming his pistol, but the figure was gone. The ledger, part of it, had survived. In the weeks that followed, newspapers across the North carried word of the Whitworth atrocities, fueled by Morrison's testimony and Washington's scars. The ruins of Seraphim's Grace smoldered, avoided by locals, who swore they heard hymns in the smoke. But no bodies of the Whitworth family were ever recovered, only ash and bone too fragmented to prove. Some claimed Miriam's hymn still echoed on the wind. Others whispered of a doctor seen in Savannah months later, pale and scarred, carrying a blackened ledger. Washington, haunted, could not sleep without hearing Grace's last words. "I can't leave them," because she hadn't, and somewhere he feared she and Seraph had not perished at all, and if even one Whitworth had survived, then their theology, their ledger, their fire, might rise again in another chapel, in another swamp, under another name. The bell of Seraphim's Grace had tolled its last, but the echo, low, mournful, and endless, still rang across the South. What burned at Seraphim's Grace was not the end, but only a scattering of embers, and embers, if left untended, always find new tinder. The question that remains is not whether the Whitworths died in that fire. The question is how many more false sanctuaries rose unseen while America looked away.